What's good, everybody? I'm Jędrek, and today I want to talk to you a bit about Countermagic and Familiars. Where to use which one is my favorite at the moment, which ones, because obviously you will play many different counterspells of various sorts in a deck like Familiars, and what might be some options that I feel are a bit underexplored, and maybe they warrant additional testing. So the motivation between this video is threefold for me. First is the desire to explore Pauper's card pool as a relative newcomer to the format. So while I've been playing Pauper a bit throughout my life in general, I probably played Pauper for the first time over 10 years ago. Only really got seriously into it last year. And I only began playing Familiars like half a year ago with like a higher intensity. And because of that, there are certain cards that the hive mind at large played and deemed for some reason unfit to run in the deck, or decided that there are just better options, and just moved past it, as it is the case in general. And I personally haven't had an experience with them, so I wanted to revisit them myself and make my own opinion, my own informed opinion on why the card is or isn't good, or maybe it is worth playing now, and when something changed. And for example, there is a certain card might have been worse in 2020, but now with how the circumstances with the format change, maybe now it's good because some conditions are different than it used to be. Next up is finding the current suite of Countermagic, or I'm finding the current suite of Countermagic a bit too narrow, polarizing at times. It's mostly in matchups where you want both negate and remove soul. The chief among them is mono blue terror and terror decks in general. When you have a negate or a remove soul and you want it to be the other one, with like somewhat often when you are fighting against this deck, and maybe my motivation, or one of my motivations, is to make this situation a bit less common given how popular terror is in general. Maybe it's impossible to do this, but I will try to do just that. And finally, it is trying to optimize the deck for the standards of 2026 Pauper. As I've said multiple times on different platforms, maybe in my videos on this channel as well, I don't really believe in a concept of metagaming, but at the same time, you can't expect to play the same list you've played 5 years ago and expect same results, because there is a thing called evolution of the format, and that's just a fact. And while metagaming for a certain tournament isn't a good idea in my opinion, changing with the format is. So I'm gonna judge the cards on a few criterias, and there will be versatility, efficiency, both with and without a familiar in play, impact on the intended matchup, and possible additional utility. And an important side note, as most of my content, I'll evaluate and discuss the cards in the context of the meeting of minds. Build of Familiars, not Modern Age, not Cryogen Relic, and I won't discuss cards that are more suited for, or better suited for those versions. For example, I'm not going to talk about Foil, or I'm not going to talk about Abjure, because those cards are not something I would ever consider playing in the deck, in this version of the deck, in Meeting of Minds version of Familiars. Let's start up with the golden trifecta of counterspells in familiars nowadays. First off is Negate. Pros of Negates are high versatility, as most things you care about are non-creature spells that either make your opponent progress their game plan or interfere with your game plan. It is decent efficiency, which decent efficiency basically means it costs 2 mana without familiar and 1 mana with familiar. That's how I classify decent efficiency. And it is meaningfully impactful in most matchups. There are few decks that don't run any important non-creature spells, but against some decks, Countermagic is just bad in general, and that's not like Negate's fault that Countermagic as a class is bad against those decks. The biggest con of Negate is that creatures are getting more and more impactful in Pauper, and like before the printing of stuff like Avenging Hunter or Monarch creatures, or even decks like Spy or the addition of Gutter Snipe to the format, you could, I think, I haven't played Familiars at that point, but I think, at least my reasoning would be that at that point you could have just ignored creatures on the stack at least, because you could just focus on using Negate to protect your game plan, and you can use Snap to deal with creatures, and you didn't really need to care about creatures all that much. And finally, we went to play Negate. I think Negate is just the safest choice when it comes to Countermagic. It is never truly bad. So if you're on the fence whether to play card A or card B, you can always just play more Negates. And I think playing 4 Negates in your 75 is totally reasonable. I wouldn't do that personally right now, but it's not the end of the world to play 4 Negates. And while my goal, once again, is to optimize the Countermagic suite, and I don't think that playing 4 Negates is optimal, I still think that it is a reasonable option, even if it's not the best one. Next up, we have Prohibit, which has high versatility, decent efficiency, once again, and is meaningfully impactful in most matchups, just like Negate. It's in general, I think, a very similar card to Negate in terms of its strengths and weaknesses. The weaknesses are expensive spells and quote-unquote fake casting costs, which mostly means affinity, and mostly means refurbished familiar. That's often played early on, and you can't counter it for 2 mana. My biggest gripe with Prohibit is that it doesn't get the same stuff that Negate doesn't get, basically, which is Avenging Hunter, which is Tolarian Terror. And while it can counter cheaper creatures, with Kicker it can even get like Thorn of the Black Rose and other Monarch creatures, or Murmuring Mystic. Not being able to counter stuff like Snuff Out for 2 mana or for 1 mana with Familiar is definitely a downside. And in general, I value Prohibit a bit lower than Negate. That said, Prohibit is a good game 1 card, as it can both get creatures and non-creatures alike, and it shines particularly when the format is cheap and efficient with few expensive spells. So if you don't expect to play against a lot of Hunters and a lot of Terrors, which isn't the case right now, I would value Prohibit higher. And I do think that the current landscape of Pauper is fairly hostile to Prohibit, and I would consider finding some alternatives to it. And there might not be any, but one of the purposes of this video is to find some, if there are. Next up, the last of the golden trifecta is the Remove Soul / Essence Scatter / Glorious Gale, whichever of those cards you want to play, for whatever reason. I personally choose Remove Soul because of the badass skeleton art that you can see on the screen right now. So, pros of playing those cards is definitely decent versatility and decent efficiency. And most importantly, it's great against more expensive creatures with dangerous ETBs that you can't get in another way. That mostly pertains to emblem creatures, to card like Balustrade Spy. To some extent, it's not truly an ETB, but what I meant with dangerous ETBs were creatures that are problematic when they resolve. And Tolarian Terror, even though it doesn't have an ETB, it is harder to deal with it once it's on the board because of its wortability. The biggest con to remove Soul is that creatures can often be handled with Snap, and only some decks run creatures that warrant Remove Soul, because ideally, in an ideal world, you wouldn't play Remove Soul, because you don't care about creatures, you blank them with Snap, you chump block them, you flicker your stuff after blocks, you have Murmuring Mystic tokens, you have much life gain with God Pharaoh's Faithful, and ideally you can just ignore creatures. But some creatures can't be ignored and have to be dealt with, and for those creatures, I think you need to play Remove Soul. So when to play it becomes kinda not self-explanatory, but I already explained. If you're expecting a lot of emblem creatures and Tolarian Terrors, then playing Remove Soul is a good idea in my opinion. Then we are moving to other options that aren't commonly played right now. The first and the most interesting one to me is Mana Leak / Lose Focus. So the biggest pros of both of them is great versatility, because it can counter anything you want, or it can target anything you want really, and decent efficiency. And one of those two is likely the best alternative to Prohibit if you want to explore that route. Obviously, the biggest con of both of those cards is falling off in the later stages of the game, and while Lose Focus is kind of insulated from that thanks to the Replicate, at the same time, I think the difference in quality between Mana Leak and just being a Quench, which is 2 mana pay counter unless its controller pay 2, is very, very big. And Mana Leak has been a mainstay for many years in different formats, and we saw it in Standard when they stopped printing Mana Leak in the Standard. How big is the step down from Mana Leak to Quench? And in Pauper, it's no different in my opinion. So personally, I would choose Mana Leak over Lose Focus. But the ability to be better later on, and also having some extra utility against Pyroblast and Countermagic in general with Replicate, is a point for Lose Focus. So if you want to play Lose Focus instead of Mana Leak for those reasons, I wouldn't suggest doing that, but I don't think it's unreasonable to play Lose Focus instead. So when to play it, both of those cards can be a good supplementation or even replacement to Prohibit in the meta games with a lot of cards that dodge Prohibit. Personally, right now, I've already started and I will continue experiment with some split of Mana Leak and Prohibit in Familiars, and like a splash of Mana Leak in general in the slots of different counterspells to have like a few Mana Leaks in my deck, because you don't want to play too many of them. For the hard testing purposes, I've entered a challenge with 4 Mana Leaks, and I think drawing 2 later in the game is a bit too punishing to just play 4 Mana Leaks as your only main deck counter. But I think playing up to 2 Mana Leaks in your 75 can be quite beneficial. From, at this point, quite limited testing, but it will get more and more extensive as the time progresses. Next up, we have Counterspell, which is a card that's very simple in a stack box and very simple in evaluating. The most important and the only pro of Counterspell is great versatility because it counters everything, and the only con of it is low efficiency because it will never be discounted. It will always cost 2 mana. So I think it's potentially a good inclusion if you expect a lot of emblem decks that can easily push through Mana Leak and Lose Focus, be it because they can generate so much mana like Elves or Utopia Sprawl decks, or because they prolong the game like Gardens do. That being said, I think always costing double blue is extremely taxing, and I've played Counterspell for the first time in a while in Familiars the other day, And even in the later stages of the game, when I had two counterspells in my sideboard, and when I drew both of them at the same time, it was very hard to sequence with them, and I felt very constrained, and maybe it was my issue and I should have been more aggressive with tapping out and stuff, but I don't like playing familiars this way. So I don't think in most circumstances I would play more than one counterspell. More than one counterspell in my sideboard, and I would stick to one copy, which I think is a reasonable idea to have in general, because it also shores up your sideboard mapping very well, because it's a card that you can reasonably bring against not every deck, but against a very large variety of the decks, and that will do well against most of those decks, even though it's a bit clunky. And if we ever get open deck list pauper events, I think having a good mix of counter spells, including, for example, this one counter spell, will be quite beneficial. So it's something I will maybe continue playing in small doses in the sideboard. Next up, we have Hydroblast and Beb, which I'm not gonna spend too much time over because it's quite clear. It's basically the best card you can have, the best interaction you can have against any red deck. And I wouldn't play more than 4 copies right now, but I wouldn't also play any less than 4 copies right now. I think 4 is a very nice number. If you want more help against Madness, I would look towards Envelop, that I will discuss later on, as additional, so quote-unquote, blasts. And also don't bring too many of them against decks like Affinity or Jant. I think if your opponent has another color in their deck than red, I would stop at 2, maybe 3 blasts against Affinity if they have like multiple makeshift munitions or something like that. Then we go to the Envelop that I've already mentioned before. Pros is great efficiency, and I haven't mentioned it with Hydroblast, but I do define great efficiency as always costing 1 mana. Whereas decent is sometimes 2, sometimes 1, and bad is always 2. I think that Envelop also has a good impact in the matchups where you want it, provided you don't bring it against like Tolarian Terror decks to counter Lorien. Mono Blue at least has some other targets, so maybe that's not the best example, but for example, Blue Black Terror only has Lorien revealed and Ponder as their sorcerers. If you don't bring Envelop against those decks, I think it's a good impact because it's a card that's meant for 2 main archetypes. First one being Madness and second being Lead the Stampede decks. The biggest con of Envelop is its low-ish versatility because it's a very hit or miss card. Sometimes you won't have it in time and your opponent casts their Lead the Stampede, and after that, even countering some further Lead the Stampede doesn't really matter because the first one is the most crucial as it lets them snowball. And it can potentially be just a meaningless card later on. That being said, it's especially if you're on the draw, it's one of the absolute best cards you can have against elves in familiars, I think. When to play it, already mentioned, already covered it. A few copies can be a good addition to the Countermagic suite against decks like Madness and Lead the Stampede piles of various variety. That doesn't sound right, but it is what it is. Then we have Steel Sabotage, which I think is the last card on our list, and if not, then I will be sorely mistaken. It has great efficiency once again and a very good impact against the decks that you want it against, particularly Affinity. The cons, one again, is a low-ish versatility, mostly like the metagame narrowness rather than the versatility in a matchup that you use it in, because if you have a Steel Sabotage matchup, then for the most part, Steel Sabotage is a quite versatile card that will counter most things. With the exception of Jant, as Jant can have a good number of problematic cards that aren't artifacts. And if you decide to bring Steel Sabotage against stuff like, for example, Gardens, That's another deck that has some targets for sabotage, but not too many, and I would argue, for the most part, against bringing sabotage against gardens if you're playing it. So when to play it, this is my preferred anti-affinity card, and it also works okay in small numbers against decks like Jant, and against more niche decks like Altertron. Against Altertron, not in small numbers, so this formatting or this sentence isn't built the best in the best way, because against Altertron it's just good, and you should bring any number of sabotages you want against Altertron. And as I've said, that's the last slide. A nice tidy 20 minutes video is basically what I wanted. So yeah, that's what I think about various Countermagic options for familiars. TLDR, I think that the Golden Trio is good, and it is played as the main Countermagic suite for a good reason. But I think there can be some slight improvements. I think that the most promising one to me right now is Mana Leak. In small quantities, I think it can be a good supplementation to Prohibit. And I might continue on including a single Counterspell in my sideboard if I feel like decks like Gardens are on the rise, and if it makes my sideboard mapping a bit more manageable, especially if I want to devote some other sideboard slots to test different cards, not necessarily Countermagic, then like playing Counterspell might make my sideboard suite of Countermagic like smaller, because instead of playing 2 Negate, 1 Remove Soul, maybe I will just play 2 Counterspells or 1 Negate, 1 Counterspell. And in this case, I can have this one slot for something else. Overall, that's it for me today. Thanks for watching. And as always, you can check all my content in the description down below. Both teachings, my Patreon, or my MetaFi rather, with familiar content, and the podcast with Skura that we've had for quite a while now. And if you have any comments, any feedback, any suggestions for next video topics, please drop them down below. I'll appreciate you, and I hope you have a great day. Bye bye.